Hello. This lecture is on the native South and Southwest in the 1600s. We're just going to get right into it today. The year is 1992, and it marked the 500th anniversary of Europe's so called discovery of the Americas. And all across the United States, it was a time of celebration. I mean, after all, without Columbus, there could be no United States, right? Many indigenous people, though, considered the Columbian I can never say it, quincentenary, quincentenary. It's the means 500 years. Uh, anyway, they considered this celebration to be a time of mourning, and for them, discovery represented the advent of a cataclysm that smashed existing social orders. Surviving Columbus, a documentary made by the Pueblo people to mark this celebration, or for them, this chapter of mourning, it offers a window on these native perspectives. A segment of they were a segment of the Spanish invasion of Pueblo homelands in the Southwest asks the audience to contemplate what names Pueblo people might give to those who set out to victimize and conquer them. Discover is not one of them. And in so doing, the documentary Surviving Columbus, it compels us to think critically about how we make sense of the past. And it offers a very different telling of history, one that celebrates 500 years of indigenous survival against seemingly impossible odds. And this lecture tells part of that story. And we're going to begin by surveying the indigenous worlds that emerged from the decline of that Mississippian tradition in the Southeast and the ancestral pueblos in the Southwest. And then we're going to focus on some case studies involving Hernando de Soto's entrada through the Southeast, and then the Pueblo Revolt, or their war for independence in the Southwest, to really understand how natives and newcomers attempted to pull each other into their worlds on terms of their own making during the 16th and 17th century. So, our key questions for today are right here. And the first question I want you to answer in your notes is: in what ways do the case studies, so specifically Hernando de Soto's Entrada and the Pueblo revolts, how do they shed light on the idea that Columbus Day might be understood as a time for mourning rather than celebration? Let's make that a question mark. And then, what do these two case studies tell us about how Native peoples made sense of European newcomers? How did they challenge the idea that Indians were overwhelmed by their presence? So, how do these case studies really tell us that, in a way, they challenge the idea that's been told time and time again in your history classes that Native Americans were overwhelmed by this presence? What evidence suggests that this wasn't actually always the case? All right, so in keeping with surviving Columbus, well, let's first consider how Native people made sense of the Spanish invasion and how they sought to restore order in its wake. And in so doing, we're going to uncover stories of negotiation and conflict, innovation and adaptation, accommodation and resistance. And the let's start with the southeast region. This is it ranges from the mid-Atlantic to the lower Mississippi Valley, and I'm really specifically looking at this section right here. All right, so this is basically the region of the Southwest for the most part, and it encompasses a large swath of coastal plains filled with saltwater marshes. If you've ever been to the state of Florida, you know what I'm talking about. It's also a rich agricultural area, but it's also got dense woodlands with hickory, oak, and pine. So it's really diverse in terms of its geography. And then west across the Appalachian Mountains, kind of in this region right here, lies another rich agricultural zone along the lower Mississippi Valley. And then further south along the eastern seaboard are the tropical Everglades. So that's, in this region right here, where current day Florida is. And there's actually very few natural borders or natural barriers to travel in this region. And so extensive trade networks linked the Southeast with the Southwest to the Caribbean to Mesoamerica. I mean, this is all the region of those ancient Mississippians, right? That were interlinked by trade. And living in this vast region were ancestors of Samoan language speakers like the Tutelo, Saponi, Ino, Shirguri, Waxhaw, and Catawba. And by the way, when I mention these, it's really just more for context. I don't expect you to memorize these, and I don't necessarily expect you to write them all down, but I do think it's important to just kind of emphasize the diversity of this region because this is, after all, Native American history. And then you have the Iroquoian language speakers in this region, like the Cherokee. You have Muskogean language speakers like the Creek, the Choctaw, the Seminole, and the Chickasaw. And then you have speakers of other distinctive language like the Natchez, the Caddo, Timucua, and Calusa. So, again, a very diverse area pre contact, right? And as we've mentioned already in this class, agriculture predominated. So we've got corns and beans and squash, which made up the three sisters. And then we also have hunting and gathering to supplement their diets, as well as fishing. Families in these tribal cultural groups were also what we call matrilinear or matrilineal. And that is they determined kinship and where they lived through the mother's line. So think of it, and it would be like in our own culture today, if instead of the tradition being if a woman gets married, she takes on the husband's name, it would be the other way around, that the husband takes the mother's or the woman's name. That's kind of what we mean by matrilineal. And most of the native peoples in this part, the southwestern section of North America, were matrilineal. And then, and also, women had great power in these cultures. They cultivated the earth, they prepared the food, they reared the children, and they made all the necessities of daily life, like finely crafted clay pots and these really beautiful, intricately woven baskets. The men, they hunted, they fished, they fashioned bows and arrows and canoes. And the Spanish, who at this when by the time they arrived in this part of North America, they had already devastated the Taino and the Caribbean, and we've learned about them already. Sort of this section right here, and that's kind of where Columbus lands, and the Taino are the first Indians that he comes in contact with, and then of course in Mexico in Mesoamerica, which is kind of where present day Mexico City is, right there. And then the Inca in Peru in South America, which I don't have in this map. But the the reality is that by the 16th century, the Spanish have basically attempted to conquer all corners of North and South America. And so the real question that I want to kind of find out is what drove the Spanish? How did they justify bringing fear and hunger, loss and death to native people and native land? And to understand that, we need to consider the three pillars of Spanish conquest. And you might often hear of them as God, glory, and gold. That's a pretty common summary in a high school history textbook, for instance. It's a great way to remember them, right? The three G's is a great mnemonic device. So the first was a lust for glorious battle. So let's talk about glory first. And this is where the Spanish rationalized in a document called, and I forgive my pronunciation for those of you who speak Spanish. I am not a native speaker, but the document's called El Requerimiento. Let me say that again. Requerimiento. I really want to get it right. I had it right before I started this lecture. Now it's not coming out right. Requerimiento. That sounds a little better, right? In English, it's the requirement. And it was devised by Spanish jurists and theologians in the early 1500s. And it announced that God had created all men, and all men were bound to obey God's will. And that the Spaniards were, and I quote, dutifully expressing God's will, and that the span dutifully expressing God's will by subduing non-Christians and reclaiming them for the Catholic Church. And conquistadors gave Indians a choice: submit or die. Now, listen to how this excerpt from the Requerimiento explains what would happen if Native people didn't embrace the church and king. I certify to you that, with the help of God, we shall forcibly enter into your country and shall subject you to the yoke and obedience of the church and of their highness. We shall take you and your wives and your children and shall make them slaves of them, and as such shall sell and dispose of them as their highness may command. And we shall take away your goods, and shall do all the harm and damage that we can as to vassals who do not obey, and who refuse to receive their lord, and resist and contradict him. And we protest that the deaths and losses which shall accrue from this are your fault, and not that of their highness or ours. And so think about what the Spaniards are saying there in that official doctrine. And essentially, violent conquest was inseparable from the glorification of God and the accumulation of wealth and riches. That it was God's ordained vision that the Spaniards would do this, and that the Indians were supposed to subdue themselves and just go along with it. And if they didn't, then they were just not being good people, and whatever punishment they experienced was really just their fault. And this, in turn, leads to that second and third pillar of Spanish conquest. Pillar number two is God, and that is the Spanish desire to convert people they considered to be heathen savages. And pillar number three was gold, or more broadly conceived, the generation of wealth from the exploitation of indigenous land and labor, right? Using Indians as slaves or very cheap labor to have them work the land and mine gold, and the goal of a conquistador was to get rich. That was really their goal, and then to go home and be some glorious hero for it. So now that we understand what drove the conquest, we have a little bit of review of the native peoples that lived in this region. The big question that I really want to address in this lecture is, how did indigenous people make sense of these newcomers? How did they respond to the invasion of their homelands? And I'd like to explore these questions in greater depth through two case studies: one of a Spanish conquistador, Hernando de Soto, in the southeast between 1539 and 1542, and then the Pueblo Revolt a century later. So we'll begin with Soto, and we're actually going to begin with his death. So I want you to imagine this scene. It's May 21, 1542. And the conquistador, Hernando de Soto, he's died of a fever somewhere near the Arkansas and Mississippi rivers where they come together. And his soldiers are a bedraggled group. I mean, they've come and gone through a lot, pillaging and plundering the Southwest or the Southeast. And they take De Soto's dead body and they paddle it to the middle of the Mississippi River and drop it into the water and send his body to the bottom. Now, surely this is not the way that Soto envisioned his death, right? He's supposed to be this great conqueror, this conquistador. Here, a mighty conquistador, a captain in the conquest of the Incas of Peru, is so unglamorously sunk to the bottom of the ocean. or the ocean, the Mississippi River. And one would not be wrong to expect something more, like a grand spectacle, maybe something filled with pomp and circumstance based on his position. Perhaps even gilded, given his desire to find the seven cities of Cibola, which were fabled to be filled with gold. Like that was what he was looking for, was this great seven cities of gold. So what explains this fate, this lack of pomp and circumstance in his death and sort of just being dumped into the river? And I'll answer that question by taking the view from southeastern Native Americans, okay, including a chiefdom called Cofitacheki. All right. Now, this is a capital chiefdom, which is located in present day South Carolina. So here it is on the map right here. Can you see that? Just draw an arrow to it. Cofitacheki in present day South Carolina. And so it features, it's a beautiful village, for lack of a better term. It features a central ceremonial plaza. It was probably the principal town of a chiefdom. It was surrounded by a large mound, thatched roofed homes, and storehouses for grain. And you can kind of see sort of an aerial illustration of how people imagine this village. And throughout the Southeast, simple chiefdoms were clusters of about 4 to 7 neighboring villages that usually had a population of about, I'd say, maybe 3,000, 3,000 to about, 5,400 people in a chiefdom. The word kingdom, chiefdom. So you have the chiefdom, and then you have all these little smaller villages, right? And together, those villages make up a chiefdom. And those chiefdoms, again, were about 3,000 to 5,400 people. And Cofitacheki was the chiefdom of many of these smaller villages. And they consisted of an alliance among several of these other more smaller villages. So in May 1540, the niece of the paramount chief, a woman the Spanish called the Lady of Cofitacheki, was carried ceremoniously to the riverbank on a white cloth draped palanquin, which is kind of pictured here, right? She's sitting on top of this throne that they're carrying for her, so she's not actually walking. And then she boarded a similarly adorned canoe, and she crossed the water where she received Hernando de Soto and his band of Spanish newcomers. And by that time, the Cofitacheki already had in their possession some Spanish trade goods, right? Because the Spanish had arrived to the Americas before this, and through trade, those goods kind of made their way up through the Southeast. And the lady had assuredly heard the stories that traveled with them, right? Not good stories. So over the past 12 months, for instance, Soto, 600 soldiers. So Soto's entourage is made up of 600 soldiers. That's a lot, right? 24 priests, because, God, glory, and gold, you need to convert. Also, 100 slaves, African and Mexican slaves, about 220 horses, 300 hogs, and a number of ferocious Irish wolfhounds. They had blundered and plundered their way through present day Florida and Georgia in search of riches equal to those found in Mexico and Peru in South America. And all along the way, they killed They kidnapped, they raped, they enslaved, and they really sent shockwaves through the surrounding areas. So the lady of Kofi Techeke also knew that these men were not the only danger stalking the land. So she had, heard rumors of these guys, and she also heard that they brought strange sicknesses with them, plagues that led to the abandonment of several nearby towns. Diseases like smallpox and tuberculosis and typhus really were one of the major weapons of European colonialism, right? So when the lady of Kofi Techeke crosses the river to greet the bearded warrior with gifts of pearls and blankets and skins and food, she was really attempting to incorporate him, De Soto, into a Kofetacheki world on Kofetacheki terms. But she was surely doing it with caution. She probably already knew the answer, but she began by asking Soto whether he intended peace or war. And acting like a conqueror rather than the potential ally that she hoped for, Soto proceeded to make a list of demands, including the pearls she was wearing. Where did you get those pearls? Tell me where they are. And the lady told him that, well, 2 years before you arrived, there was a sickness that drove many of the inhabitants nearby away from their villages. And she told him to go there to find the riches. She's like pointing the opposite direction, like, go there. And she's just trying to get rid of him, right? So Soto and his men did exactly that. They plundered a mortuary temple. They took pound upon pound of pearls off the bodies of the dead, as well as European trade items like glass beads, crucifixes, and metal tools. They were unsatisfied, and so they returned to Kofi Techeki. They took captives and hostages, including the lady, before continuing on into present-day North Carolina. And so, moving to the south and west, Soto and his men proceeded into Tennessee and North Carolina, present day Tennessee and northern Georgia. They spent about 100 days plundering and terrorizing Coosa. You can see, I'm just kind of going along the map here. Here's where they land. And then again, here's Kofi Techeke. And they just plunder their way. Here's Coosa. I just mentioned Coosa. And it was another wealthy paramount chiefdom that had influenced this vast area. And then in present day Alabama and Tennessee, they proceeded to attack virtually all of the palisaded towns they encountered, just all along this path, as you can see, all through Arkansas and down here. And as had previously happened, news of the invaders always traveled ahead of them. And kind of the point of this lecture is that it shaped the approaches Native people adopted. Again, we're trying to illustrate that Native Americans were not just these passive victims that let bad things happen to them, right? That they tried to either accommodate the Spanish, like the lady did. They tried to diplomacy, and they even fought back. So, for instance, in October of 1450 or 1540, in the Tuscaloosa in Mobila, right here, which was a chiefdom near present-day Selma, Alabama, they welcomed the Spaniards much like the lady of Kofi Techeke had. But this time, the ceremonies and giving of gifts weren't an invitation to forge an alliance, but the laying of a trap. And this time, several thousand warriors concealed themselves in Mobila houses. And when the Tuscaloosa struck, they struck hard. But the Spaniards recovered, and they delivered a devastating counterattack, slaughtering thousands of Tuscaloosas and burning the town to the ground. And in the ashes, they planted Christian crosses as ceremonies of possession, meaning that once a cross was planted in the ground, that was symbolic that Spain now owned this land. And this destruction continued into present day Mississippi, Tennessee, and Arkansas, where some chiefdoms were forced to surrender their corn to the invaders. And this brought hunger and starvation to the people. In May of 1541. So that was kind of like this October section kind of takes us, to about this region right here. And then in May of 1541, they're 2 years into the expedition. Soto's men crossed the Mississippi, and now their mission turned from seeking cities of gold to an increasingly desperate search for a route home. And all along the way, the Caddo, the Natchez, and other peoples took every opportunity to defend their homelands against the Spaniards by adopting guerrilla tactics, avoiding open confrontations they knew they couldn't win. Right. So they didn't, their weapons couldn't match the weapons of the Spaniards. So they would hide and do kind of shock and awe surprise attacks. In the Arkansas River Valley, during the winter of 1541 to 1542, De Soto's desperation deepened. He was really sick, and down the Arkansas the expedition went. And on the brink of death, Soto ordered one last assault on a town the Spaniards called Anlico. And on foot and horseback, with wolfhounds by their side, they slaughtered about 100 people. So that is kind of a summary of De Soto's conquest there in red, and kind of the various timeline that it took in the last in 2 years time. So now we have the context we need to understand the inglorious death of Hernando de Soto that I mentioned earlier. That Soto and his men, they really proved unwilling to integrate themselves into the world as Southeastern Indian people understood it. And rather than honoring indigenous expectations of kinship, alliance, and reciprocity, they killed, they enslaved, they raped, and they stole. What must the native peoples of the Southeast have thought of this conquistador? Well, thousands of them died at the end of Spanish plagues, in the jaws of wolfhounds, and from the wasting effects of starvation and disease. And those who survived mourned the deaths of their loved ones. They grieved for those who had been taken captive, hostage, and sold into slavery. And so the fact that De Soto's men sank his body to the depth of the Mississippi, where it could never have been found, speaks volumes with regard to what they knew they had done. After 4 years, 4 months, and some 4,000 miles, just 300 Spanish stragglers emerged from the Mississippi in 1543, with little to show other than a legacy of violence. And when the Spaniards returned some 20 years later, the colonists found what scholars refer to as a shatter zone throughout the eastern North America. The shatter zone refers to a large region of instability throughout this geographic space of North America, really from the late 1500s to the early 1700s. And you remember the Mississippians, right? Those very famous Mississippian cultures, and places like Cahokia and the mound builders. You know, this this time period, this Spanish conquest, the Spanish invasion, it really created these shatter zones by introducing European diseases, and it destabilized the region through fur and slave trade, violence, and war. And it was really, what it really brought on was a cultural, political, and spiritual disruption, as well as dislocation and psychological stress. And at the same time, out of this chaos and an invasion, this place also was kind of born anew, right? Out of the Mississippian cultures, there were new native people basically rebuilt their towns. They replanted their fields, they replenished their storehouses, and in place of the chiefdoms like Cotepechequi that the Spanish had encountered in these densely settled areas, they actually formed new nations and confederacies. And The survivors of this collapse really restored order in these shatter zones by producing new societies in the 17th century and today that we know as the Creek and the Choctaw, the Chickasaw, the Cherokee, and the Catawba. So, again, Native American history is about survival and resilience, right? Okay, so moving into the Southwest, we enter case study 2, and we find that Pueblo people also had to grapple with the Spanish and their seemingly insatiable lust for glory, God, and gold. And as we'll see, the colonial project followed a different trajectory in the Southwest, but it represented many of the same challenges and it proved no less stabilizing. So, the events that I'm going to describe to you that culminated in something called the Pueblo Revolt in 1680, I think represent another attempt by indigenous people to restore order, right? Survival and resilience. So, the 16th century Pueblo world was the product of great changes, many of which had been inaugurated by the out migration of the ancestral Pueblos from places like Chaco Canyon and Mesa Verde by 1300. And these population shifts in turn led to their merging with surrounding Indian communities in all directions. So by the 1500s, the Pueblo world included a number of towns or pueblos concentrated in regions along the Rio Grande. And you can see that in the map right here. I'll change this pen color again. Let's just go with black. Here's the Rio Grande right here. And then you can see this is the section of the Pueblo world. And these people shared life ways. So they had a lot of common cultural characteristics, but they were also really diverse. Like they weren't just one people. They spoke 6 different languages among all of them. For instance, the Pueblos at Taos spoke Northern Tiwa. The Pueblos at San Juan spoke Tiwa. And the Pueblos at Peco spoke Towa, all from the Tanoan language family. Then we have another language family at Acoma, about an hour west of modern day Albuquerque. And these Pueblos spoke Caresan. So they're kind of located over here. Oops. They're kind of located over here. I'll just circle it, it's easier. Kind of in this region right here. And not all Pueblos lived along the Rio Grande. There were also the Zuni to the west, and even further out. I'm just going to erase that because I got it wrong. It's more close to the Rio Grande, more over here, because it's this section where we have the Zuni. They're more westward over in this direction of the Pueblo world. And so the Hopi, spelled with an I, Hopi. And they spoke languages called Zuni and Hopi, which were related neither to each other nor to any of the Pueblo languages. So the point here is that we have 6 different language groups in this Pueblo world. And again, I think it's always good to emphasize that this is a Native American history lesson, and we want to focus on the great diversity and uniqueness of all Native peoples. So, speaking of uniqueness, I love the adobe homes of Pueblos. The I mean, it's just a remarkable invention. They're naturally solar heated in the sense that their earthen bricks soaked up the heat from the sun and stored it in a way that provided even temperatures from dawn to dawn. So, in a way, you kind of have like this natural air conditioning. And local communities, they had very beautiful ceremonies in plazas. They built semi subterranean structures like this one right here, that in their architectural form reflected Pueblo stories of emergence from a world below. I mean, it's just so rich and beautiful. The Pueblo built a rich life rooted in a sedentary village supported by agriculture. So this myth that native peoples were all nomadic and roamed the prairies and lived in teepees is not true, because in North America we have agricultural societies, just like those that emerged in Afro-Eurasia thousands of years ago. We also have Athabascan speakers, including the Navajo and the Apache or the Apache. They actually moved into the area on either side of the Pueblo, so they kind of inhabited kind of these areas right here. And they arrived a little bit later in the 13th and 16th centuries. And while Hopi oral tradition refers to the Navajo as head pounders, right? The Navajo got the nickname head pounder, which really suggests that their arrival was attended by conflict, that it wasn't necessarily loved. But there was also considerable exchange, and they traded goods, but they also traded ideas. They traded architectural styles and ceremonial practices, and they got married and made love and had children and forged kinship ties. Pecos Pueblo, for instance, was a hub in a far-ranging trade network that extended to the plains. The plains kind of being right here. So you know, if you have these outliers right here, right, you kind of become an intermediary between different Indian groups, and it makes trade very possible between different geographic regions and different native groups. So, you know, we already looked at the Southeast chiefdoms like Cotepechequi, but and like them, the Pueblos first encountered the Spanish slave raiders and conquistadors. And as early as 1539, Zunis at the Pueblo of Hawiku, they clashed with the Spaniards. So this was in 1539. They clashed with the Spaniards who were in search of great riches. And even before their arrival, the Zuni had already heard reports about the Spanish and the slave raiders who had attacked indigenous communities in northern Mexico, you know, laying waste to the elderly, taking the young into captivity. And so they rightly approached these newcomers that they heard about with caution, suspicion, and eventually hostility. So the following year in 1540, Francisco Vázquez de Coronado returns to Haiku, this time with an army of Spanish and indigenous warriors driven by new rumors that he would find Cibola and the seven cities of gold. So again, it's all about the riches, right? The glory and the gold. The Zuni weren't anxious to see them. And in fact, Coronado's expedition was met by 200 Zuni warriors and a cornmeal line. The line was literally made of yellow cornmeal that the Zuni had sprinkled across the road leading into Haiku. The cornmeal line symbolically closed the road like a fence, and it was meant to convey that Zuni ceremonies were in progress, in this case, a summer solstice ritual. And so Pueblo pilgrims were away from the city to conduct these ceremonies. And the idea with this cornmeal, which was a tradition, this cornmeal line, you know, it symbolized that there were no visitors that were allowed to come into Haiku until they had returned. And to cross this cornmeal line would have been considered a great offense, you know, inhospitable and presumptuous to the extreme. But of course, Coronado didn't respect the cornmeal line and he crosses it. And this gives great offense. And then he proceeds to attack the Zuni. He takes their food. He insists upon their conversion to Christianity. His rampage started this 3-year traveling show of horrors as the Spaniards moved from Pueblo to Pueblo, then onto the plains and back again, wreaking havoc in search of gold. And I just want to zoom in on the particular map here of Coronado's expedition that starts in 1540. And I'm just going to give you a sense, a moment to kind of check that out. You see the Hopi, the Hopi are right here. The general Navajo group are here, the Apache and the Cheyenne. And you can see that the direction of their journey is, you know, starts in the south, it moves up into Pueblo land, back up over here in present day Kansas, and then back down the way they came. So the first attempt to colonize the Pueblo world began 50 years later, after Coronado's expeditions, when Juan de Oñate arrived with 560 people, thousands of sheep and goats, and hundreds of horses and cattle to establish a region in the Spanish called New Mexico. And once again, the Pueblos were met with violence. In late December 1598, for instance, a member of Oñete's expedition named Juan de Saldivar sparked conflict in Ocama, which was known as the Sky City. Saldivar was killed, and the Spanish responded with a campaign that resulted in the deaths of 800 Pueblo men, women, and children. Another 500 were taken captive, punished, and sold into slavery, or sent to Catholic convents in what had become known as Mexico City. And by the way, in the lesson, there is a link to a 7-minute NPR podcast story about New Mexico wrestling. Got to spell that right, with this history. And this picture is very powerful to me. At the top, you have a statue of Juan de Oñete and a commemoration of sort of the birth of New Mexico. And then down below, you have an indigenous person who is basically saying, stop, you know, we should not be celebrating this. And so this NPR story is a great summary of kind of this debate that's going on today. You know, should these kinds of statues remain in place? And if they do, what kind of message does that send about this country's history, particularly as it relates to indigenous America? So back to colonizing the Pueblo. Once they had established a foothold, and this happened all over the Americas where the Spanish had conquered, by the way, what I'm about to talk about. So once they had established a foothold, Spanish colonial authorities, they began generating wealth by exploiting land, and in the story today, the Pueblo land and labor, through something called the encomienda and repartimiento systems. So through encomienda, the holders of Spanish land grants, so like let's say the Spanish crown gives a conquistador a grant that says, hey, any land you conquer can be yours, right? These land grants are known as encomenderos. And if you had a land grant, you were given by the king authority to demand labor and tribute from the Indians who lived on or near their plantations. And I put "their" in quotation marks because you know why. Is not really the Spanish lands, right? They had taken it through conquest. So now they have, according to the king, they have these land grants. They can demand labor and tribute from Indians. And in return, the encomenderos were expected to instruct native workers on Christianity and often how to read and write. One particular Spaniard, Bernal Diaz, he was a former conquistador. He wrote a memoir called Containing a True and Full Account of the Discovery and Conquest of Mexico and the New Spain. And he summarized the contradictory objectives of the encomenderos as being to serve God and his majesty, to give light to those who are in darkness, and to grow rich, as all men desire to do. So in 1542, the Spanish began replacing the encomienda system with repartimiento, meaning a partition or a distribution. And it imposed force, albeit paid, meaning that the laborers weren't technically slave because they did get some payment. But I'm hesitant to call it actual paid labor. It really was more like slavery. Indians were required to supply labor pools for the Spaniard mines where they could, mining iron and silver. They also had to labor in the agricultural fields. They even had to build churches and roads. And this was a very exploitative system. And it also reinforced a state of debt peonage on indigenous people throughout New Spain and New Mexico. And debt peonage is a system where the employer basically makes you work to pay off a debt through work. It's illegal now for obvious reasons, but let's just say that the native worker uh, has had to borrow money to survive, and to pay it back, they're compelled to work in the mines for the conquistador or for the encomienda. And so that is basically a system of slavery, and it was a very common feature of Native American slavery. Now, through the early 17th century, the systems controlling the land and labor of indigenous people, they became ever more oppressive. Pueblo women were increasingly subjected to abuse. Colonial authorities imposed a governance structure that disempowered traditional Pueblo leaders, took away their dignity and power. And missionaries grew really hostile toward Pueblo religious practices. And the Spanish filled in the Pueblo kivas, or worship areas, with earth, and then just planted crosses on top of them. So a real disrespect to the Pueblo people. So by the mid 1600s, this Rio Grande Valley that I pointed out in the previous map was also struggling with disease and drought. And a drought, of course, is not man-made, at least at this time. Is just bad luck in that case. But they're also struck with disease. So the Pueblo people are suffering massive losses relative to their smallish population in the beginning. So they might have started with a population of 40,000, and by between 1638 and 1670, their population declined to about 17,000. And in the meantime, the Navajo and Apache, they were adopting horses that the Spaniards had brought, and they were using them to great effect in raiding Spanish and Pueblo settlements, taking people from both communities into slavery. You'll learn a little bit about them in the book, The Other Slavery. But it's very interesting that groups like the Comanche kind of built their own empire of slavery by kidnapping both Spanish and Pueblo people and selling them into slavery. So again, it's the history is very complicated, right? And history is because we're dealing with human beings and generations of them at that. So, how did the Pueblo interpret this new world that was being turned upside down? They're victimized by the Spaniards. They're victimized by the Comanche, um, and so many Pueblos came to believe that this is kind of what they thought, that when Jesus came, their corn mothers went away. And that is to say, the Pueblo social order had fallen apart and needed to be restored in order for their rituals to work and for life to continue. And to restore harmony and balance, Pueblo chiefs led public performances of prayers and dances and ceremonies. And the Spanish retaliated with whipping, castration, and rape. And there was a major breaking point in 1675 when 47 Tiwa medicine men were punished by Spanish authorities for performing traditional dances and ceremonies in public. 3 of them were executed, and one committed suicide, and the rest were imprisoned in present-day Santa Fe, which was a Spanish city at the time, and sentenced to be sold into slavery for their supposed witchcraft. That's what the Spanish viewed it as. So a group of Pueblo warriors, though, traveled to Santa Fe, confronted the Spanish officials, and actually secured the prisoners' release. Yet again, another example of how Native peoples resisted conquest, and another example of survival and resilience. Now, among those sentenced to be sold into slavery was one of my favorite Native American historical figures, Pope. Pope was a San Juan Pueblo who laid the foundation for an ambitious Pueblo rebellion against Spanish colonial oppression. It's known commonly as the Pueblo Revolt, and you will read more about this in your book, but it might be better thought of as the Pueblo War for Independence. In fact, some historians now are calling it the first war for independence in North America. They were joined by the Navajo and their Apache allies, and the Pueblo launched coordinated attacks in August of 1680. And the violence resulted in the deaths of about 400 colonists and 20 priests. The Pueblos destroyed missions and they wiped excrement or feces on the crucifixes. And some sought to reverse their baptisms. So, maybe some of them had kind of quote unquote converted to Christianity, and they tried to reverse the baptisms through that process. But ultimately, Santa Fe became the site of the final siege. And after 9 days, the Spaniards escaped and withdrew entirely from New Mexico. All right, so the Spanish are defeated in just 9 days. Now, from the perspective of many Pueblo participants, God was now dead from their perspective. And the Pueblos were unable to restore the entirety of this pre existing social order. Many of the Pueblos were able to sort of reestablish themselves in the mountains, contributing to a reorganization of Pueblo life. But on the whole, a harmony and a balanced life didn't really occur after this revolt. And the succeeding years didn't help because it saw drought, pestilence, hunger, and political turmoil. And so when the Spanish returned in 1692 and 1698, the Spanish return, they return with a vengeance. And at Santa Fe in December of 1693, they executed 70 Pueblo men and distributed about 400 Indian women and children as slaves to colonists. And so this Pueblo struggle for independence resulted in a reconquest, but it was far from over. So across this time period, the 1500s to the 1600s in Southeast and Southwest North America, Native people tried to pull newcomers into their worlds, right? On terms of their own making. We see that with the lady and her act of diplomacy, for instance. They did so only to find that the leaders of these bewildering bands of Europeans refused to reciprocate their gifts. And in recalling these failures, we return to the questions from that documentary that I mentioned at the beginning, Surviving Columbus. And we're reminded of the variable ways in which history is remembered. We acknowledge that if some people celebrate the so called discovery that was made in 1492, others see reasons to mourn the physical and spiritual suffering, the pain and the loss that this discovery unleashed. And yet, Native peoples in the Southeast and Southwest endured. They named the conqueror, but they did not accept the name conquered. Instead, they would continue to search for common ground. So I want you to go back to the lecture questions today and make sure that you can answer those. Hopefully, you've taken some good notes. Just a reminder, I don't expect you to know all the names of all the tribes, but definitely in this case, we want to kind of understand the whole story. So we want to understand the Mississippians that the Spanish invaded. We want to understand the Pueblos that they invaded, and just a general sense of the geography of the southeast and the southwest. And then you definitely want to know the names of some of those major conquerors, as well as the Pueblo Revolt. So use evidence from the lecture to answer these two questions. And I also want you to take a moment and listen to that NPR podcast that I had mentioned earlier. All right, everyone, thank you.